Grüß, willkommen in einer Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 48 of my game system design series videos. In this video I'll be investigating figure gaming playing areas, or specifically the terrain types and densities of terrain you should expect on a Napoleonic era figure gaming playing area. I'll be specifically covering Marengo, Innaustadt, Wagram and Leipzig. After completing my conversion of a SPI quadrigame into a figure gaming format, I made some interesting observations about terrain. This made me think I may be getting terrain very wrong for my musket and pike era playing areas. To assist me in confirming this, I will analyse a number of historical battlefields and determine what type of playing areas would duplicate these historical battles. Based on this, I hope to derive a more accurate playing area setup process. For those who haven't viewed my earlier videos, just for some background, someone on the internet suggested to me one way of obtaining a set of figure gaming rules which allow you to simulate an entire battle would be to convert a board game into a figure gaming format. The original suggestion envisaged the use of hexes, which was an idea I tried many years ago and rejected. However, it made me think if I could still do this if I made some changes to the game system, replacing hexes with the concept of movement and combat zones of control. This ended up working very well, and I started converting a series of small games into a figure gaming format. The first games were the first SPI quadrigames, the first being Marengo, shown here. This is the second version of this video. In the interim between the first and second version, I'd managed to convert a large number of SPI quadrigames into a figure gaming format. The second quadrigame maps could be joined together to create one large map if you so desire, allowing you to simulate the entire Waterloo campaign. I've calculated this would require a playing area of about 6 feet by 8 feet, which is rather large, but it is possible for those people interested in it. I suspect that aspect of my project will not be practical, but I will probably convert the rules into a more generic figure gaming format to allow for points-based games and allow me to simulate other battles not covered by the SPI quadrigames. Part of the effort involved in this conversion was the conversion of a board gaming map into a figure gaming playing area. I'm using 3 feet by 4 feet playing areas to represent the board game map. The scale between these initial 4 games do vary, but not as much as I originally thought, with each hex ranging from between 400 and 800 metres according to the standard rules, but closer to about 250 and 600 metres per hex when I analyse the maps very carefully. The one thing I really noticed when I looked at the board game maps was a large number of built-up areas, rivers, streams and roads, and the lack of woods. Hills were a special case, which I'll cover in more detail later. Let's start with the first analysis, which will be the Battle of Marengo. This shows a map of the Battle of Marengo. The Austrians are in red on the left. This image shows the SPI Marengo map on its side. Each hex represents 200 to 300 metres. The first battle was fought behind the stream in front of Marengo, which was about 10 hexes long. I converted this map into a 90 cm by 120 cm playing area, which is 3 by 4 feet, and later we'll determine how typical this scale is for a normal figure game. But let's first look at the terrain features of this map. If we ignore Alexandria on the extreme left, there are a lot of small built-up areas, each of which is 1 hex in size, or 200 to 300 square metres in size, and 2 hexes, or 250 by 500 metres in size. Each of these towns, or villages, provided a reasonable defensive bonus for any unit in them, thus would probably represent stone buildings. A village of these sizes would consist of about 25 to 50 buildings and a population of between 100 and 200. Just to note, this is larger than a stone farmhouse such as Hougoumont at Waterloo. I suspect Hougoumont was a 80 square metre building, or at the very most 100 square metre, making it about 25% of the size of these particular built-up areas. Prior to this, I rarely deployed any more than 3 buildings on a Napoleonic playing area. Each would normally be a 6 centimetre square. On the other hand, when I play World War II or Moderns, I commonly deploy 12 to 24 built-up areas, each of which is typically a 3 centimetre square. My World War II scales are normally between 1 to 5,000 and 1 in 10,000, so possibly scale could be a factor in this difference. We'll drill down into the latter to see if scale is the cause of this difference in the number of built-up areas. Let's next look at rivers and streams. Rivers are unpassable except as bridges, while streams provide a significant defensive advantage. While I certainly do deploy rivers and streams on my playing area, I rarely have games where I'm forced to fight across a stream. I also never deploy as many water features as you see here. Even in my World War II games, I avoid the use of water features which affect play. This could be due to the scenario, as a water feature between two forces which are reasonably equal, make for a very poor game. Once again, we'll drill down into the latter in the video to see if the scenario is the factor here. Woods and rough terrain depiction was not unusual. Woods represent woods and rough represents rough ground. I'm uncertain exactly what rough really means. Rough terrain does not affect line of sight and only affects movement and defence. I don't think it means rough hills, but putting that detail aside, the number of these terrain features were, if anything, less than a figure game and not exactly distributed evenly. This is almost certainly due to the terrain the battle was fought, and I do not see anything overwhelmingly significant here. The next feature to cover is slopes. If attacking up a slope, the defender gets a significant benefit. I originally thought this was some form of unique terrain, but in retrospect, this probably represents significant hills and slopes running up a hill. Basically, this was a hill. The two takeaways were the combat benefits of being up a hill, and the second was the presence of only 2 or 3 hills, one very large and 2 very small. While many figure gaming rules have movement penalties for moving up a hill, and some rules have a reverse slope defensive benefit, the main effect of hills is typically line of sight in figure gaming. This makes me think that perhaps rules should contain larger benefits for defenders when being attacked up a hill. There are a number of accounts of how Blücher was considered foolish not to place his troop behind the crest of a hill at Ligny. Instead, he placed them on the forward slope. These accounts are mainly English, so it could be because of the English preference of reverse slope deployment and the puzzlement of why the Prussians didn't copy it. I suspect the reason Blücher did this was being up a hill gave his troops a major benefit if attacked, and if he went behind the crest, French skirmishers would simply take the crest and pepper the Prussians from a crest position. The British did not have this issue because their skirmishers could easily keep the French skirmishers at bay. This is my theory, and while it could be wrong, it does explain a lot of what historically occurred in this particular battle, Ligny that is. In order to compare this with a figure game playing area, we need to derive some basic scales, so we can compare. In my conversion, each hex represents 4 centimetres, which means 1 centimetre represents from 50 metres to 60 metres, or a scale of 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 6,000. While a lot of rules sit in the 1 in 1,000 scale range, the main larger scale rules, such as WRG, use a scale of 1 in 3,000. Shaco uses 1 in 5,000, Napoleon's Battle 1 in 3,600, DBN 1 in 3,000, Age of Eagles 1 in 4,000. I'll not cover big base rules, instead we'll only focus on standard figure gaming rules, but big bases rules vary more and are generally higher than standard element-based rules. Marengo does use a larger scale, but the playing area is 3 feet by 4 feet, which by figure gaming standards is small. If I drop the scale to 1 in 2,500, the playing area becomes 6 feet by 8 feet, large but not impossible. At 2,500 or 1 in 2,500 scale, it's pretty close to a traditional 15mm figure gaming set of rules. So while scale does have some effect, it's not the primary effect in this particular case in terms of the way the terrain is deployed. Based on this very short analysis, most figure gaming players lack sufficient built-up areas and water features on their playing area. It's also possible many figure gaming rules do not correctly reflect slopes in combat, but this, I must admit, does vary by rules. There is a 25mm effectors play as well. As a general point, terrain features should not be any smaller than an element width, or any area terrain feature should accommodate a single element. At 25 millimeters, the element width is greater, so the terrain features which should be deployed are reduced. However, this is only a difference when we compare 4 centimeter wide bases, that's 15 mil, versus 6 centimeter wide bases, which is 25 mil. So it's not really a full explanation for why there is so few built-up areas and water features in a typical playing or figure game playing area. I personally feel the reason why the terrain density is as it is in figure gaming is convention. In Napoleonic's, most area terrain features are much larger than element base width, possibly twice the size. This would reduce the number of area terrain features you could deploy. In World War II figure games, for example, this is not the case, and area terrain features are commonly the size of an element, which is normally 3 centimeters wide. Does Napoleonic's rules get it right and World War II figure gaming getting it wrong? I expect it depends on what rules designers want to achieve. In World War II, terrain features were critical, and modelling every terrain feature which could be used is important and necessary. In Napoleonic's, most rules designers tend to avoid terrain features as much as possible. The main objective is modelling troops meeting each other on a flat terrain. Terrain features just get in the way. However, I suspect in reality terrain features also got in the way historically and should be really modelled. This shows the playing area guide which I use for the creation of my playing area for the Battle of Marengo. The built-up areas are easy to resolve, as I currently possess 3 cm and 4 cm square built-up BUA terrain pieces, which I place buildings on when not occupied by defenders. I just need to deploy more of these in this case. The hills or slopes are also easy. I just need to create a large flat top hill resembling the hill shown here. The other 2 small hills I can ignore or create some small hills to reflect this. Just a quick note, historically there was no big hill, I discovered this later. It was actually a collection of smaller hills, just as a caveat. The biggest issue here is the streams and rivers, which I'll either embed these in a special MDF playing area or create separate pieces of rivers and stream terrain which can be placed on top of my standard playing area. The roads were my major issue, but in retrospect roads are only useful when they cross rivers and streams, so I just need to include bridges on my water terrain features. The other use of roads is moving through rough terrain, which I could easily create a special rule which allows this if enemies are not close by. Otherwise I can pretty much ignore roads except for aesthetic reasons. Let's now look at the next battle, the Battle of Jena Osterdutz. The Prussians are in red and with Jena at the bottom. Historically, the reason why this was such a disaster were both Prussian forces retreated towards each other, and when they met it was a mess. Somewhere between the 2 blobs of red here. This shows the SPI board game, Jena Osterdutz. There were 2 battles, thus 2 playing areas. The ground scale moves up to 400 meters per hex, which means our scale now moves to 1 in 10,000, or 1 centimeter equals 100 meters on a figure game. While on this map smaller villages are now ignored, there are more larger villages, and we generally retain the same density of built-up areas. Remember, in this game each terrain feature is as large as a unit, is considered significant enough to include on the playing area. Changing the scale from 1 in 200 to 1 in 400 does not really affect this very much. When we look at water features, there are less and at Jena non-existent. However, the water features at Osterdutz does have a major play effect. As for slopes, this map uses them a lot more, and I've attempted to convert them into what are obviously gentle hills. If my guess is correct, there are a lot of hills here, a lot more than you would normally have in a typical figure game. This shows my playing area guide for this battle. Lots of hills, some woods, and a large water feature in one playing area. I should be able to duplicate this with a generic playing area with the terrain features placed on top of it. Let's now move to the next battle, the Battle of Vergam, which is in the top, almost center of this map. In this map, north is at the top, while the playing area have north pointing to the bottom. I think this is an error. Historically, the Austrian right flank advanced, which was probably an error, but as Napoleon's main effort was on his right, probably expected. This shows the SPI board game map for Vergam. The first point here is there are a lot of roads. There is no way I can duplicate this on a playing area unless I use historically accurate road widths. Then it would look more like a map than a playing area. Duplicating roads did cause me some issues, but then I realised in this case they were mainly used to cross water features, which can be duplicated by simply placing bridges on the necessary crossing points and allow for faster movement by units using some special rule. The latter could be duplicated by the use of a strategic movement rule. As long as a unit never moves within a certain distance from the enemy, we can assume every hex has a road. Thus, the road problem is solved. One interesting point about this battle, the French had to get over a stream. While the stream was not large, it stopped cavalry and artillery from crossing and caused the infantry significant issues. There are very few figure games I've ever played where the main task of an attacker was to get over a significant piece of terrain such as this. I think this is the key difference between board gaming and figure gaming. Board gaming is all about duplicating a historical conflict. Figure gaming is not in the most part and is maybe more chess-like. A surprising number of Napoleonic battles were fought between very uneven force mixes. The first half of Marengo, Jena and also Wagram are good examples of this. Even at Waterloo, the French had an advantage, at least initially. It was just those damn Prussians that spoiled their show. This shows my playing area guide for the Battle of Wagram. Once again, this can be duplicated with a plain, unmarked playing area with custom created terrain features placed on it to represent the battle. The scale here is 1 in 10,000 if using a 3x4 foot playing area. As I've previously mentioned, I do not deploy the roads, although I do include a few for aesthetic reason. It's all about the water feature crossing impact of roads that I'm interested in. This shows the initial deployment of the Battle of Wagram, with the map contrast reduced in intensity so the elements can be seen clearly. The facing is generic and the elements would normally be facing each other rather than what's shown here. Unfortunately, the Austrians, being white, are not that clear, but you should be able to see the Austrian front line reasonably clearly. This is not a form up in an open valley and come and get me type battle. It was a battle where Napoleon had to crush the main Austrian army before the Austrian army of Italy joined up with it. He had already failed once, and in this case, obviously, he had succeeded. The one aspect which strikes me is the deployment. Few figure gamers would start a game with a deployment similar to this. The Austrian right flank moved against the weaker French left flank and got rather close to the island when Napoleon had placed his siege artillery. I expect they were attempting to cut the French off. In all the games I've played, this has never occurred, that is the board games. The Austrians are firmly on the defensive. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Victory conditions can be modified to force a more historical game if you wish. Generally, I do not like the victory conditions in most of the SPI board games. The final battle we'll cover is the Battle of Leipzig. All maps point north. This is the third day and it really shows how much trouble Napoleon ended up being in. Luckily for him, there were some heavy forests and waterways between his retreat path and Blucher, otherwise it would have been another Ulm. Now we come to an SPI monster game, Leipzig. The ground scale remains at 400 metres per hex, or 1 in 10,000 if using a 3x4 foot playing area. To keep troop numbers down, the strength point scale was altered a great deal. This battle would have involved a lot of urban fighting and had a lot of built-up areas, which were actually involved in the battle. Marengo has more, but most were never involved in the battle. In this case, fighting in Leipzig is a real possibility, and there is a lot of fighting in the smaller towns on the right of the river. This battle has the most terrain of any of my playing areas, which is surprising considering the ground scale is the same. There was also a lot of water features, which would result in a massive amount of custom terrain building. The way I do flexible water features is to cut a piece of MDF, which represents a river and is about 4 centimetres from one side to the other side. In this case, I would need to create a very wide river terrain piece to represent the double river, but as I do not wish to create a whole 3x4 foot playing area, which could be used only for the Battle of Leipzig, this may be what I'll do. I would also mount the woods on it as well. Just as an interesting point, since I created the first video, I actually went ahead and created 2 custom Leipzig playing areas because, quite frankly, the battle is just so interesting. My own conclusion of this analysis is I need to put more thought into terrain for my Napoleonic playing areas. I do a good job for World War II and moderns, or Cold War, but my Napoleonic playing areas are not realistic, unless fighting in the steppes of Russia. Defensive positions are more common, either built-up areas, small streams or slopes. Opposing areas meeting on a billiard table is possibly not the way to get a realistic feel for Napoleonic combat. This shows a DBN, which is a set of rules, built-up area layout, 3 BUAs, each of which is much larger than a single element and thus represents a reasonably large built-up area. This shows the same playing area with the built-up areas the same size as an element, which in this case is 4 centimetres square. This is a World War II built-up area, and I suspect they are more suitable for Napoleonics than the lesser but larger built-up areas that I showed earlier for DBN. As you can see at the top, you would still need to have some larger built-up areas, which in this case would represent between a 400 to 800 square metre built-up area, a reasonably large town. While recreating historical conflicts tends to be self-correcting once you do your research, a lot of effort needs to go into generic scenarios to get something which resembles reality for the period. For World War II, I never fight a meeting engagement between equal forces. That scenario is simply not realistic, or if it did occur, was more often an error and resulted in a very poor game. I suspect I need to move down this path with Napoleonics as well, as most of the better managed battles later in the war resembled World War II battles for position rather than attempt to destroy an army in a single operational battle, similar to, let's say, a typical Ancients battle. The attempt to destroy an army in a single battle still exists, such as maybe Borodino, but were not the norm post-1812. It was all about recreating Ulm or Leipzig, for example. The original video was created around about 3 to 4 years ago, and in this period my initial thoughts towards setting up terrain on a playing area have gone through many different generations. I'll not bore you with the process in this video and will instead provide a brief outline of my current conclusion, which I have no doubt will change in the future. The first point is every time I try to create a setup system, I fail miserably. It either ends up being too complex or so simple it could be gamed and generally results in an unusual playing area. In the end, I created a basic terrain piece with roads and streams and allowed one player to deploy terrain and the other to select the player edge. This shows one of the 2 basic playing area layouts I use for pretty much all my Napoleonics, World War II and Cold War. The roads and streams are embedded into the playing area, which is a 3 by 4 foot piece of 3mm MDF. The built-up setup is very simple and does depend on the level of urbanisation, but if we assume central Germany, I place a built-up area on each objective first, shown here, the red stars. I then place a built-up area in between each objectives on the road. If the infrastructure is poor, I skip this particular step. I then place built-up areas on streams where a road crosses, unless a built-up area already exists close by. If a stream does not have a built-up area on it, I place at least one, even if it's not on a road. Finally, I select one of the non-objective built-up areas and create or convert it into a large town, perhaps 2 to 3 bases in size. This should be on a stream if possible, but it could be pretty much anywhere you so desire. Now comes woods. I place woods on a stream in any area available free of built-up areas and roads, with some gaps in between them. They should be on one bank and no more than 4 per stream. If the area is heavily wooded, I increase this to 6 per stream, and if there is a lack of woods, I reduce this to 2 per stream. Finally comes the hills, which should be in between the streams. There are 5 gaps between streams here. From 2 to 6 hills are placed in each gap, 4 being standard, 2 if the terrain is flat, and 6 if the terrain is unduly rough. The opposing player now selects the player edge. The reason why I set up the hills in this way is because obviously the streams are going to represent the lowest point of your playing area, so the ground in between the stream should represent your highest point of the playing area. This system is not perfect, but I found if you pile up the terrain pieces that you think you need, and force the players to deploy the entire terrain as quickly as possible, you generally end up with an interesting playing area. You don't want a player to sit there and contemplate, where to place the terrain for some sort of advantage. But nonetheless, most players tend not to be that gamey, I hope. And so we come to a conclusion of my episode 48 of my video series on game design theory, in this case realistic figure gaming terrain for the Napoleonic period. Now off to building custom terrain features. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hilfe zu kämpfen.